Welcome, everybody, to the first official Academy for International Cooperation Peace Roundtable of 2025. It is very, very historic that we are currently on the cusp of something unknown. As Thomas Paine had said, these are the times that try men's souls. There's a lot of points of great danger to humanity as a whole that we have been pushing on, that we have been sliding into, both domestically as far as North America, we are facing, and the transatlantic more broadly, a systemic economic crisis that is many years coming, that is yet to be properly addressed. We have the slide into war on many fronts that could easily go nuclear. We see that there's points of tension, hotspots in Eastern Europe, many of which have yet to even be lit on fire, although we know that there are arsonists looking about places that have kindling. In the Pacific, we see also a very belligerent conversation that hasn't necessarily gone away. And the Middle East, of course, on fire is just a set of Gordian knots. So we need very, very bright people to make thinking about the future and about systemic solutions much more popular. Hence, Ed and myself, this is why we decided at this moment it would be a good idea to launch these peace roundtables. Today, we are just a few hours, in a sense. Monday will be the inauguration day. We don't know exactly what the outcome will be. There's a lot of reason for points of hope as well as points of caution. I personally speaking appreciate the an introduction of a quality of disruption if we've had only unipolar hegemonists with a technocratic ideology acting like human robots for many years. I appreciate the shaking up when we see that Trump, especially, and certain people around him, want to make actual business deals instead of just operating on an ideological bent. So that's something I appreciate. But what is that going to mean? We don't know exactly. We don't. Hence, we have today a few very special guests. Peter Kuznick, who has recently, many people might have seen in the episode of Joe Rogan featuring Oliver Stone. Peter Kuznick.
Actually, Matt, it was Tucker Carlson, not Joe Rogan.
Did I just say Joe Rogan? What a weird mental glitch that was. That was strange. Sorry about that. Of
From your
course.
mouth to Joe Rogan's ears.
Yeah, right. Eh? Weird mental fart. Yeah, of course, Tucker Carlson. Which was a very brilliant intervention on the mindset of those hegemonists pushing us towards nuclear war. I thought that was a very breath of fresh air. We'll hopefully have Professor Hall Gardner. Ed will say a few words as well. And Marty Sieff, of course, has a few thoughts to contribute regarding the hopes and the dangers. Ray McGovern wanted to be here, but due to an emergency, he could not make it last minute. Hopefully, we'll have him on in the next session. But without further ado, I'm going to open up for Ed to share his thoughts and go forward from there.
Well, I'm in Washington, and yesterday we made a walk down to the White House. We couldn't get pretty close because it's surrounded by fence and police, and which tell them to go away, go away. So it's more like a war zone. Actually, the weather was beautiful, just sun, beautiful, and even today it's okay. So the reason that inauguration is moved inside, I think it's not necessarily weather only, but security. Security. We know there have been assassination attempts on Trump, and so he decided to make it safer, make America safe again. Right? This is, now it's very popular to say every time you should make America and then something else, and then make America safe again. Well, it's but still there's some hope, as Marty said, because with previous administration there was no hope, and in the last days they did many things to disrupt, and all this positive agenda that we were hoping for. Biden team did many bad things. Some of them could be reversed, but we will know only what's really going on January 21. And first thing is to start negotiations for the peace in Ukraine, and how it's going to happen, we don't know. We can only hope, but at least now we have some hope, and this is good. Yes, I just think that Peter would be very appropriate for him to step in, because he is now, as you know, he is a professor of history at American University in Washington, and this is a place where John Kennedy made his famous speech, what we call peace speech. And since we say that our roundtables are related to the word peace, this is when in 1963, John Kennedy, after this Caribbean missile crisis, which almost brought us to a nuclear war, was resolved with Kennedy's help. And this is the place. So now we will have Peter in place of John Kennedy from the same location, close one, to say something we know that he is a great peacemaker. I think I already mentioned many times that his nomination for Nobel Peace Prize actually got the medal, and Peter was invited to Japan, and he took part in the ceremonies. After that, he made many other shows. Actually, yesterday, I think you mentioned something about this, what you call peace rally. So maybe it would be appropriate for Peter to jump in, and then maybe we can follow up. Peter, it's your floor. You are probably the major peacemaker in this group. So why don't you just move on?
The last time I spoke to this group, Ed, I didn't make much peace. It was rather contentious. And I still have those same concerns, but you mentioned a couple things. You mentioned the Kennedy's American University commencement address, which I think is the greatest presidential speech of the 20th century, and I've written quite a bit about it. And it does come out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, because Kennedy comes in there as a real Cold Warrior. And he and Khrushchev both understood that they had lost control. They not only was the intelligence faulty, the U.S. thought that there were 10,000 Soviets in Cuba. There were 42,000. The U.S. thought there were 100,000 armed Cubans. There were 270,000. And the U.S. did not know that the battlefield nuclear weapons were in Cuba. And we had only found some of the launch sites. So we were going there blind. And had the U.S. gone in there, McNamara finally concluded we would have lost 100,000 troops. And we would have definitely taken out Cuba and almost certainly started a nuclear war against the Soviet Union. And what we know now about nuclear winter, we wouldn't be here today had that happened. And they knew how close they had come. So they did go out of their way afterwards, both of them. And initially, Kennedy was somewhat slow in responding to Khrushchev's overtures. Khrushchev wrote that great letter on October 30th saying, "From evil, some good must come. Our people have both felt the burning flames of thermonuclear war. What we have to do now is eliminate every conflict between us that could cause another crisis." And they proceeded to do so. And the tragedy, of course, was the assassination. But what happened that's so interesting about Kennedy's commencement address is it was initiated by Sorensen, but they did not allow any of no input from the State Department, the CIA, or the Pentagon. They didn't allow them to see it beforehand or have any access to it. And that's partly why it was such a great address. And what Kennedy calls for there is ending the Cold War and ending the arms race. It's a vision that no other president has embraced since then. You might say that Carter did for a minute or two till Brzezinski got control of him. And I've just been writing about that. and giving talks about that. So, um, that's the vision we need. Does Donald Trump have that vision? Not in the same way that Kennedy articulated it, but there are some positives, and I'm willing to recognize that. Uh, I give Trump a lot of the credit for the ceasefire in the Middle East right now. Biden did not get that done in 15 months. In fact, he fueled the flames of war there, and Trump came in there and made clear that he wanted this ended, and it happened. Uh, and I was doing an Indian TV interview earlier this morning, and I didn't even know because I was at the Peace Ball last night. But Trump has said that he wants his first overseas trip in the first 100 days to be to China, which I thought was remarkable. I was stunned when they asked me about it on Indian TV this morning, and I think it's a wonderful step in the right thing to happen. Um, we know that Trump during his first term was a real China hawk. We know that he started effectively a trade war with China, and that a lot of his advisors were very, very hostile to China. If you heard Marco Rubio's talk the other day, his the testimony, he at his the hearings, again, he and so many of the others around Trump are real China haters. And are they going to have Trump's ear, or the more reasonable people like Tulsi and Bobby Kennedy on this issue going to have Trump's ear? We don't know. Uh, the but I'm giving Trump certainly credit for doing what he's doing, and of course on Ukraine, which we're all hoping Trump is going to not going to do it on the first day like he promised, but even if we put pressure on both sides to end the fighting there, that's also going to be in the interest of humanity, because as Matt was saying, the risk of nuclear war is real, it's palpable, it's great, and it's terrifying. So I did go to Oslo. I think Ed mentioned I went to Japan. No, I'm going to go. What you might be referring to, Ed, is on Friday night, I did a webinar for more than 100 Japanese journalists and policy experts, in which I was talking about where Japan fits into the U.S. plans for war against China. I know our group has spoken a lot more about Russia than we do about China, but if we're talking about peace, among the dangers that we face in the upcoming period is the threat of war with China, triggered likely by the situation over Taiwan, but also potentially the South China Sea. And and I told the group a story that I don't know if we've ever mentioned here, but back in 2019, Jimmy Carter spoke to his church congregation in Plains, Georgia, and he said, I had a phone call last night from Donald Trump, and he was very worried about China. And Jimmy Carter says, and I told him, I don't fear the Chinese century, I welcome it. He said, do you know how many times China's been at war with anybody since 1979? Zero. He said, and the United States has been constantly at war. He said that if you look at the 242 years of American history, the United States has known 16 years of peace. He said we're the most warlike nation in the history of the world. He said if we had spent our trillions of dollars like China has on high-speed railway, they said they've got 18,000 miles of high-speed railway. We've got zero. If we put that money into healthcare and housing and education, not getting rid of the Department of Education, but bolstering education. He said that would be so much in the interests of the United States and the rest of the world. And so the Japanese journalists were very, very concerned because the U.S. planned for war. And we know that General Minihan told his forces recently that he expects the United States and China will be at war in 2025. We've had others, Davidson and others, say they're prepared, Admiral Davidson, that they're preparing for war by 2027. We know what the U.S. war plans are, and they depend upon China, Japan, and South Korea. Now the U.S. has operational control in the event of war, not only of South Korean forces, but also of Japanese forces. And that's what the United States is going to need in order to carry out that war that they're talking about against China over Taiwan. So the fact that Trump, who unlike Biden, Biden said on at least four, maybe up to six occasions, now that if China and Taiwan go to war, the U.S. is going to militarily intervene on behalf of Taiwan. That's not U.S. policy. U.S. policy is strategic ambiguity, and his staff had to walk it back every time. But we know that's what Biden was thinking. Trump has been much more circumspect when it comes to what the plans are. And he said that Taiwan should be paying U.S. Protection money effectively for U.S. policy there. So anyway, so with all of this going on, so the reason I went on Tucker's show, I have a student, a very, very close former student, who's a Trump insider. And we were having lunch, and I asked him, what's the best way to influence Trump's foreign policy? He said, either go on Tucker Carlson or Joe Rogan's show. He said, that's what Trump watches, and the people around him do as well. So he said we should use the fact that Tulsi Gabbard, when she did an interview with the New York Times in 2019, the Times reporter asked her, it's a big feature on her, they asked her, what podcasts do you watch? She says, I don't want to talk about podcasts, but I do want to talk about the untold history of the United States. She said, I've just been watching it and reading it, and everybody should watch this and learn what real history is, not the stuff that we've been taught all our lives. And so she gave that endorsement to my project with Oliver Stone. And so my student thought I could use that. So I called up Oliver. He loved the idea. He agreed that we're at such a critical juncture now, so close to war and nuclear war. So Oliver wanted to come on, and we got in touch with Tucker, and he was very happy to have us. And what Tucker's concern was, we had dinner with Tucker first the night before, then we're on for 2 hours, and it was very, very friendly because he agrees with a lot of us on how dangerous the world is right now. The first thing he said when I sat down with him dinner, he said, Peter, you know, I'm really a leftist when it comes to foreign policy and economic policy. And you know what he means by that is that he's anti-war, anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and is very worried about nuclear war. So what he expressed privately is the same concern that I have, that if you look at Trump's nominees and appointees, most of them are not our people. Most of them are not people who are going to push for reasonable, peaceful, diplomatic solutions. He's got a lot of neocons in there. And I don't know, you guys know them all. I don't have to start naming the Sebastian Gorkers and the Rubios and the Waltzes and the others. So the question is, so Tucker was expressing his concern about that. He said he had just spoken to Trump a couple of days before. So we had dinner on Sunday night. He'd spoken to Trump on Friday, and he'd spoken to Tulsi earlier on Sunday or Monday. And he said he says this to Trump directly. You know, these people you have around you are poisonous. They're toxic. They're dangerous. And so the question is, but that's why I see the positive signs of what's happening in Gaza, positive sign about wanting to reach out to Xi Jinping, positive sign about wanting to end the war in Ukraine. So I'm very, very hopeful. I even said, since I nominated this year's Nobel Peace Prize winners, Nihon Hidankyo, I announced, maybe it was on Tucker's show, that I'm happy to nominate Donald Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize if he abolishes nuclear weapons and ends these wars that we're facing now. So so I think we're at a crucial, as Matt was saying, a crucial inflection point right now. We could go in the direction of peace and prosperity and development, or we could go in a different direction, you know. And I'm the signs I'm reading right now, I find very, very encouraging, and I hope they continue. And whatever pressure we can put, or support we can give, or incentives we can give to keep Trump moving in that direction, I think That's the future of humanity. And I'm working with people in order to try to reach Guterres at the United Nations and the Pope. I'm working on both of those because I'd like to see. Ed and I have talked about a new Yalta. I'm giving a talk. I've got a recorded talk for a conference in Moscow about Yalta, the previous Yalta. And Ed and I have talked about the need for new Yalta, and Ed's written about this. And what I've been suggesting is we need a global summit. We need a summit between Trump, Xi Jinping, uh, Putin, Modi, maybe Lula, maybe some others, but a small summit in which we sit down and we look for diplomatic alternatives, peaceful resolutions to some of these problems so that we can deal with the things that really concern us. Among them is the fact that the richest 8 people in the world have more wealth than the poorest 4 billion people. Climate change is real and getting worse. That I mean, there's so many things we have to deal with, pandemics, and so wasting money. This is something that I'm taking issue with Trump when he said he wants uh, NATO to be spending 5% of their GDP on their militaries. Uh, that's the opposite of what I would like to see. I would like to see them cut back from 2% to 0.5% or less. I want to see us stop wasting money, as Eisenhower said in his great speech in 1953 after Stalin died. He said, this is all this money we're wasting on our militaries is a theft from what people really need. And so I want to see us go the opposite direction with that. Anyway, just a few opening thoughts and
No, that's good.
hand it back.
Yeah, no, that's very constructive, Peter. Thank you. And yeah, I was also very surprised to see the open dialogue, that initiative between Trump and his Chinese counterparts as well. And I know he officially invited Xi Jinping, who obviously couldn't make it. However, I was pleased to see that Chinese Vice President Han Zheng will be there for the inauguration, which I don't know how a lot of those neocon hawks feel about those types of maneuvers. I'm curious what types of discussions are happening behind the scenes. I'm sure there's a few unchoiced vulgar words being thrown out there, but it also reminded me in 2019 when Trump also made an announcement from the Oval Office bypassing the State Department and invited Vice Premier of China to the Oval Office, and they gave this press conference. And then Trump, in the course, April 5th, 2019, said, sitting next to the Vice Premier, between Russia, China, and us, I have a little quote here on a slide. We are making hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons, including nuclear, which is ridiculous. I think it's much better if we all got together and didn't make these weapons. Those 3 countries, I think, can come together and stop the spending and spend on things that are more productive towards long-term peace. And I really appreciated that because, again, it wasn't announced, and it demonstrated how personal relations matter a lot more around Trump than the type of acting on a script that we've typically seen over the last decades. So hopefully what you just said is right. And if you do want to cut down on spending, go for the military. I mean, I don't know why people are afraid of talking about the military as something you can't possibly slash spending on. The world would thank us. So with that, let's leave the stage here for Marty. Marty, are you still there?
I'm
Martin
here.
Sieff, for those who don't know, I think everyone knows Martin Sieff, but if they don't, he's been a gumshoe journalist, a analyst, a historian who's written many books. He has been the Washington Times correspondent for many years for Washington, D.C. He's hobnobbed with very, very high-level power players over the years and has developed a lot of insights into the psychology of policymaking, and somebody who's just been very good at forecasting processes for good or for bad. So, Marty, thank you for taking the time. What are your thoughts on the current situation?
Thank you very much, Matt. First of all, Ed and Peter, of course, have made it very easy for me. Ed made a pitch perfect opening, and I'm happy to endorse, as always, but especially now to endorse Peter's, as usual, brilliant, courageous, comprehensive analysis. I think he's already, what's the word? Simply, he's drawn a map for us, a map out of the maze. And if we follow Peter's map, If we can follow Peter's map and help him implement it, we can save the world. It is quite literally as simple as that. That's the beginning. But you asked me, Matt, to assess the pros and cons of what we see with the administration coming in. And Peter was much more optimistic about them than I expected. And in fact, in the reversal of our usual positions, Peter, you're much more optimistic about them right now than I am, which obviously gives you great delight. Obviously, I've been too much exposed to you and your assessments over the years. I wish you were right. I hope Ed is right. But I think you have spelled out some key issues I further want to go into. Who is going to have Trump's ear? Will it be Tulsi and Bobby Kennedy Jr., as we rightly should hope and pray for? No, it will not. It will be the Secretary of State, it will be the National Security Advisor, and it will be the Secretary of Defense. And Trump has chosen all these people. And they are catastrophes, every one of them, for reasons both Ed and Peter acknowledge and well recognize. But it's not just them as individuals. They are in charge of super hawkish, out of control bureaucracies, which they will not make any effort to rein in, but instead will enthusiastically whip the fires up. So why did Trump do it? Well, first of all, for the reasons Peter rightly said. What is the way to Trump's brain? What is the way to the way he thinks? And there's both good and bad to this, but one has to understand it. Yes, he watches Joe Rogan. Yes, he watches Tucker. But most of all, he has always watched Fox News. And that is central. And we need to get Peter and Ed onto Fox News as much as possible. You really should try and get me onto Fox News. I was made verbatim for them 10 years ago. They used to have me on a great deal on North Korea, and they would let me speak for 10 to 15-second sound bites, and they always had me back. And then they let me speak for a 2-minute sound back, and they never had me on again, because I was able to speak more of what I actually thought on both North Korea and related issues. Exactly, Peter. You had influenced me even then. What can I say? But I've been verboten for them ever since. But that is the way into Trump's brain. It is the highway. It is the super parkway. It is the New Jersey Turnpike into the president-elect's brain. And there are good aspects of this and also bad. But what we also see is a repetition of both the strengths and the appalling failures of the president's first term from 2017 to 2021. On economic issues, whether you love him or loathe him, he got what he wanted until the COVID pandemic, no doubt clearly fanned from the outside, clearly fanned by forces from within the United States, shut down the American economy. But until then, in his macroeconomic terms, his policies worked. He knew what he wanted, and for either good or evil, or both, he got them. And he never changed his Secretary of the Treasury. He never changed his Commerce Secretary. When it came to business issues, investment issues, Wall Street issues, he knew financial issues. He knew who he wanted. He knew what he wanted. He appointed the people he was sure of, who were loyal to him, implemented his policies, and he stuck with them through thick and thin. This is completely different from the fake image we see of Trump as an idiot, as irresponsible, irrational, because he was on home ground. But when it came to foreign policy, national security, and defense issues, it was a totally different story. He kept appointing national security advisors who betrayed him, who backstabbed him, who openly had nothing but for contempt for him, and tried to destroy him and destroy his reputation when he fired them after he had raised them up and they owed him so much in the first place. John Bolton in particular, of course, but others. He should have known the kind of people these idiots were to begin with. He simply took them at face value on Fox News, just as he took Pete Hegseth. So I believe we already see him repeating the major weaknesses and errors. He genuinely wants peace. He single-handedly is responsible for the ceasefire in Gaza, but for the very reasons Peter rightly and realistically gave him full credit for. But who has he surrounded himself with? He has surrounded himself with out-of-control, extreme right-wing Zionist fanatics who revere Netanyahu. And Mr. Netanyahu, who I knew all too well in my 30s when I was in New York City, and who I have followed closely ever since, and whose hit list I have been on since 1996, which is quite venerable, I would maintain. I do not believe he is sane. I believe he was told by the late Menahem Schneerson, known as the Lubavitch Rebbe of New York City, usually misrepresented as a lovable, harmless, spiritual, mystical, sweet, good-natured champion of peace. He was anything but. He was a delusional messianic idiot. And he told Netanyahu back in 1986-87, when Netanyahu was still in New York as the Israeli ambassador to the UN, that he would become prime minister of Israel, and he would be prime minister of Israel until the Messiah comes. And it is my assessment, which you see nowhere else, that Netanyahu is in no way a conventional religious man. I personally witnessed when he visited us at the Washington Times, his favorite lunch was pork sausages, and he had an enormous, unlimited appetite for them. Incidentally, he's not alone in that. Every Likud prime minister since Menachem Begin, and including Begin, enjoyed ham and egg breakfasts, privately, of course, right? Every one of them. But Netanyahu is superstitious. And I believe he really believed Schneerson then. He believes him now. And he's a very sick man, much more than is publicly admitted. He nearly died last year before he had an emergency pacemaker installed. He has been in the hospital recently. His most important political allies, who basically pull the strings on them, the religious fanatics Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who control the police, who control the finance ministry, and use that power. I see many friends on our side who regard Netanyahu and the extremists around him as not representing Israel and the Israeli people. Unfortunately, they do. They don't represent all of them, of course, but they represent at least half of them. And the half of them they represent are organized and united, whereas the secular, sensible, sane half of Israel, including the modern religious Orthodox, are not united, are fractured into lots of different little political parties, and are tactically, politically inept, when Netanyahu is not. But most of all, Trump has appointed Netanyahu worshippers and protectors to every key position. Rubio, impeccable background as a super-Israel, pro-Israel hawk, number one. Keith Kellogg, obviously, as national security advisor, number two. If you look at Hegseth, he would not have been allowed on Fox in the first place had he not been impeccably, fanatically pro-Netanyahu. And a very key position, the new Israeli U.S. ambassador to Israel, which is always a powerful and enabling bridge between the national security establishment and the State Department in Washington and the Netanyahu government, is Governor Mike Huckabee. Now, personally, Huckabee, I've met him. He's a kind, nice, honorable, decent, idealistic, well-meaning man. He's also a twit. He believes Netanyahu has a million divine angels, both Christian and Jewish, floating around his head and ensuring the invincibility of Israel at every point. These people really believe this, and it's very, very dangerous. And I predict the Israeli strategic overextension into Syria will continue, will metastasize and get out of control. And a piece I hope to be writing for you, actually, Ed, is, as you and Peter especially know, and you, Matt, I am a sucker for obscure but hugely relevant historical analogies that nobody else has ever heard of. Now, the neocons revere the catastrophic Winston Churchill, who did save Western civilization in 1940, but it was a miracle we won the war despite him being there for the rest of the war. And he sent hundreds of thousands of British boys to their deaths in Gallipoli and sank a third of the Royal Navy through sheer incompetence even in World War I, and he was even worse in World War II. In 1919, Churchill and David Lloyd George encouraged the Prime Minister of Greece, Venizelos, to invade and permanently occupy and colonize Asia Minor, all of Turkey. And it was a catastrophe. It was insane. Greece had a far tinier population base and potential military base. They couldn't have colonized Turkey even if they were serious about it. What they got was the total annihilation of the Greek army, 500,000 refugees, hundreds of thousands of dead massacred in the war, and the total elimination of a Greek civilization which the tolerant Ottoman Turks had protected in Greece, in Asia Minor, over the previous 500 years, and 3,000 years of Greek settlement in Asia Minor was annihilated because Churchill gave Venizelos the wild dream of overextending into Turkey when they couldn't do it. And that is what I believe Rubio and Kellogg and Huckabee, and therefore Trump too, will give Netanyahu the green light on to create a greater Israel in Syria, and they're not capable of doing it. It's going to be strategic over. My God, they have to deal with Hamas. They have to deal with Hezbollah. They've got Iran there as well. Don't they have enough to take care of? Well, of course they do, but they're not sane. There are many sane people in Israel, including in the army, but they are not making policy. And I have no confidence that Trump and his people will rein them in. But and the fundamental issue, which I finish on, of course, is the biggest of all. Ukraine, peace with Russia, partnership with Russia. Here again, we see the great paradox of Trump. Trump genuinely wants peace with Russia. He has spoken respectfully of President Putin. President Putin even now speaks respectfully of him. Yet Trump has also surrounded himself with the Russia haters and despisers. He has sabotaged his own policies and vision before he even took office. And there was one final point here. My old friend Wayne Murray, retired veteran State Department officer, a crucial cable he sent in 1994-95 to the State Department has only now been declassified, in which Wayne presciently warns that the Russian people are dying in their millions, dying like flies as a direct result of the crash free market policies which the Clinton administration and Strobe Talbot and most of all Larry Summers as Secretary of the Treasury imposed wildly on them. Russian figures on this are rejected in the United States. I believe they are very accurate. They're 27 million dead. And I was in Russia in those years. I saw with my own eyes what Wayne also saw. And I was, not being an eminent figure in the State Department, I was even free to write it at the time. The Washington Times was basically a Russia-hating outfit. But the foreign desk had been set up by Arnold de Borgraaf, who already left the paper by that point, as an autonomous outfit. And the people who ran the paper were so incompetent and ignorant of foreign policy, you could actually tell the truth in it. You could slip it through the gaps. They weren't paying any attention to what went in the inside pages of the paper. And people like me and my wonderful special affairs desk editor, the late Pete McQueen, we were able to get away for a decade with telling the truth. It was an amazing time. Nobody paid attention to us, of course, but it's there. If you pull it up from LexisNexis, it's all there. Russian people are dying in their millions. The economic policies are a catastrophe. The 60% in the public sector are not being paid. The Russian people who are so pro-American through the Cold War, and especially in the last decade, are being turned into America haters because they blame the American people for the hideous literal genocide which is being imposed upon them. It's all in the Washington Times in those years. Jerry Sieper wrote it, and I wrote it. And we documented it at great length in those years, and nobody paid attention. Nobody, and we were so ignored, it wasn't even necessary to censor us the way Wayne Murray, for being an honest man, was censored and his career broken in the Department of State. But it was true then. So this is the situation we inherit in Russia today. And there is one crucial difference. Up to the early years of Clinton, and it changed in the second term already, it was changing, but through the Cold War, the quality of American diplomats and analysts covering the Soviet Union and early Russia was outstanding. Our dear friend Ray McGovern is, of course, the dean of these people. He was outstanding. He personally briefed 4 or 5 American Republican presidents. And his analyses from those years still stands the test of time today. People who were sent to Moscow were like Tom Graham, who eventually became ambassador, or Wayne Murray again. Again, outstanding people, men of the highest integrity and ability and intelligence and courage. But it's not been true for 20 years because the State Department is now far more neocon and extreme than the Department of Defense is in its analysts. Far more so. because Hillary Clinton brought first they came in under in the Bush administration, in the second half of the Bush Jr. administration under that idiot Condoleezza Rice. My old friend Paul Goebel, who was actually a Russia basher but a brilliant man in his day, described he was director of State Department nationalities at the Department of State in the late 80s and early 90s, and he would only refer to future Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice as the tea lady, because he said in any sanely run Department of State, she would be wheeling the tea trolley around to the department. She had no higher cognitive abilities for anything. And this is my considered assessment, watching her track record for 8 years as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. It is true, and you can say it because she's black, because she's a lady, and because in those days she was young and is still a very attractive lady. So it is politically incorrect to say anything disrespectful. And far worse happened when Hillary Clinton came in. Under Barack Obama, and Obama gave her a free hand as Secretary of State, and she filled the Department of State with her own neocon and neoliberal destructive people. And this is where Antony Blinken comes from, and this is where Jake Sullivan comes from. And I recommend, in closing here, a terrifying book to read by a man I despise, and that is what's his name? Bob Woodward, Mr. Watergate superhero himself. His new book is called War, and it is about how macho and manly and vigorous and courageous Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan are. Now, my personal self-image of myself, Matt twits me about this, we've discussed it openly, is still, I'm an unsophisticated 11 or 12-year-old little boy just discovering girls in puberty on the streets of Belfast, and I have no tact and diplomacy whatsoever, so I say what I see. And what do you see? What is the body language of Antony Blinken and Jake Sullivan? Is it of a seasoned, experienced combat veteran or brilliant military analyst like Colonel Doug McGregor? Is it of a veteran, seasoned historian, an outspoken defier of conventional wisdom like Peter or Ed? No. We see insecure little twits. If you've ever seen Rowan Atkinson play Mr. Bean on the old famous British comedy show, you have seen Jake Sullivan. Jake Sullivan is Mr. Bean. These are cowardly little shits, which they had to be to flourish under Hillary Clinton. And as a result, they overcompensate in fantasies. They are also Danny Kaye playing The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. And this is all openly expressed and documented by Bob Woodward in his book of hagiography about them. My own I close here, but my own journalistic touchstone and inspiration, a hugely politically incorrect figure, gone many years now, the late British wit, drunkard, a womanizer, hack and journalist, Malcolm Muggeridge. Don't you love him already? And I recommend to everyone here the best and most witty and hilariously funny and wise and true political history of the first half of the 20th century is his memoirs, Chronicles of Wasted Time. Chronicles of Wasted Time. And he saw these people and he saw them as they were. And he especially had an insight into the people who worshipped Stalin, and most of all into Walter Duranty, who still a proud holder of the New York Times. He is on their wall as one of the great Pulitzer Prize heroes, who was a genocide denier. He denied the genocide in Ukraine in the late 1920s and early 30s. And I was involved with then democratic Ukrainian governments, Ukrainian activists also in America, to try and get the New York Times to take his and the Pulitzer Committee to remove him from the list of, to have him dishonorably removed as a genocide denier. Now, the New York Times has 30 or more Pulitzer Prize winners for whatever that's worth. You would think that's more than enough. You could think they could do without one psychopathic liar. But no, know they had to keep him there, and they still do. But Margaret, who knew him personally, said he was a small, crippled, weak little man who therefore revered Stalin because he revered cruelty. Margaret had this great insight, and like I said, this drunken woman, I was a genuinely devout Christian. But
Marty,
yes, I finish here. This is Blinken. But these are the policies Trump must reverse, and he's not going to reverse them. Because my bottom line is this: we don't have the expertise in government anymore to talk to the Russians seriously and be taken seriously by the Russians. We have the people, but they are not in the positions of power, and Trump isn't putting them there. And this is the fundamental reason we are still on the road to possibly imminent thermonuclear war, and certainly a real danger of it. Thank you.
That was quite the dose of realism, and I do appreciate that immensely, Marty. And what I like about you, Marty, is that you're not of the academic world, and so the type of knowledge that you have gleaned comes directly from firsthand knowledge, having drinks with people in power over decades of learning how to schmooze, how to get into people's psychology, how to understand how to like just simply understand how the world moves for good or for bad. And that reminds me a lot of Socrates, who I also admire, in that you have to see
Socrates. But if I may, I've seen a president of the United States drunk in person. How many can anyone else in this audience say they've seen that? Was George Herbert Walker Bush a very responsible president at that?
Yes. So exactly, you can't learn that in a university curriculum, but I appreciate that because that's real world knowledge. So again, Marty, your assessment is very, very much appreciated, very cogent. Thank you, and I think that sets the stage. I'm curious to see how Professor Hall Gardner takes your baton and runs with that in what direction. So Hall, are you there right now? Can you hear
I'm
me?
here. Can you see me?
Oh yeah, there you are. Hey.
Am I hearable? I apologize. I had a problem with the computer as usual, but I finally got a different computer working.
Okay.
So I missed the first beginning, but I did hear Peter. I missed Ed. I'd like to say something in between, and I'll try to relate some of the comments made by both speakers. I heard Peter. First of all, let me say this. I totally agree with the assessment. We have nobody. We have no real men in office with men in the foreign service at the top leadership that have the experience of people like George Kennan and Paul Nitze. It's very interesting how Paul Nitze and Kennan were hardliners on containment. Well, Nitze was harder line than Kennan, but both of them came out against NATO enlargement precisely because they had the experience of the Cold War to know what was going to happen. They also were opposed. They may have been opposed to they wanted to get the Soviet Union out of Eastern Europe, but they didn't want to wreck the Soviet Empire. They were against the breakup of the empire, but they knew that once the empire broke up, we had to engage in a new policy towards Russia. And that has been totally lost from every administration from Clinton on. So that's the first point. The second point on Trump is he doesn't know whether he's a Timocrat or a plutocrat. A Timocrat being get back to Pluto, we mentioned a neoconservative, that's modern. We could call the Democrats neocons. Plutocrat, he doesn't know. So he doesn't know if he's a militarist or an appeasing plutocrat, a wealthy, only caring about money and trade and not caring about ideology and territorial gain. So Trump's mentality it's caught between the two. And that's where his peace through strength policy comes from. He can't decide. He thinks peace through strength is going to bring him something. So he's proposing that NATO spend 5% on defense. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to. First of all, it's a big question whether or not they can do it. Secondly, it would be smarter, instead of trying to undermine the European Union, try to bring it together. You could actually reduce military costs if the Europeans would come together and coordinate their defense spending a little bit better, rather making this arbitrarily bureaucratic, arbitrary figure that everybody has to spend 2% and now 5%, and concentrating on military that's effective and necessary for defensive purposes, not for offensive purposes. So that's the first point. Let me go back to Peter's point, and I'll get to Russia. I will talk about the China issue is absolutely crucial. the possibility of war is probably as great with China as maybe with Russia, maybe greater with China. It depends. Iran, that's a real possibility of the Trump administration for the reasons already outlined because of the U.S. Over support for Israel. But the point is, for just let me make this point, then I'll go to I was going to talk just about Russia today. But there is a possibility, you've got this issue that you're either going to have China take over Taiwan or Taiwan declare independence. Both of them are no-goes. There are diplomatic compromises you can make between China and Taiwan. You can create a confederal relationship between the two and with international backing. I've been arguing that for a number of years now. And it just means diplomacy. It means working direct with the Chinese and with the Taiwanese and coming up with a solution to that. We do not have to go to war with China if we begin to negotiate this. But the problem is, if Trump, as he says, wants to put that incredible 60% or whatever tariffs on China, you're not going to get China's assistance either in dealing with Taiwan or dealing with Russia, where you need Chinese diplomacy to help bring this war to an end. So let me get to the Russian point of view, Russian issue, U.S.-Russian relations. And so my basic argument here is that if we're going to have a sustainable Ukraine-Russia peace, we need to really undo, step by step, 40 years of neo-containment policy. I think that was said earlier. This began with the NATO enlargement process, but it also included the strengthening of defense relations with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and now we have the AUKUS Pact. We've created this encirclement that has actually forced Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran closer and closer together, so that Russia has just forged a defense pact with Iran after forging a strategic partnership. You don't want to call it a defense pact, even though it has defense relations, and one with North Korea. Plus, it's a no-limit strategic partnership with China. All this is a consequence of Clinton administration policy from the very beginning that has been continued from every administration since then in slight variations. So if we're going to begin to wind this down, to begin to transform it, which Trump has talked about, but kind of inarticulately, he was never very clear on what he meant when he was against NATO and in the previous thing. That was the wrong way to phrase things. He continues to phrase things in the wrong way. We can still reform things without totally breaking up the system. So first, the Trump administration will need to establish a ceasefire leading to a sustainable peace in Ukraine. It has to be sustainable. This is what the Russians want. It can't be just a temporary deal. Secondly, Trump will have to implement a new NATO-Russia partnership accord to update the 1997 NATO-Russian Founding Act to restore trust by way of revising NATO's defense policies as they impact Russia in the world. Now, that means reassessing the ballistic missile defense systems. It means reassessing how we approach Russia and what kind of oversight Russia will be allowed to have in a new Europe. It means looking at all those questions in a new way. And finally, as I've already hinted, the Trump administration, this is the big deal and the most important, most difficult, if we're going to prevent a global war, and I've been warning the global war could take place. I've been arguing since the 90s that our policy was heading towards major power war, is to say to look at the objectively as possible and how to ameliorate the geostrategic and political economic tensions posed by the new strategic partnerships that have been forged by Russia with China, North Korea, as well as Iran, among others, that have been formed in result of the U.S. tightening of defense relations with Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, as well as with Israel. All these, we're forming a polarized global system between the U.S. and its alliances and Russia and China and their alliances. And if we don't break that polarization, we will be headed. One of these regions will provoke us and bring us into conflict. So the problem is, but if you can immediately, the Russia-Ukraine one is the one that can help ameliorate the others, because Russia is more or less the link between all of them. So obviously, Trump has promised to achieve peace in 6 months. He promised 24 hours, but he finally realized that ain't going to happen. And let's hope he has the 6 months he can do something. It looks positive for Israel and Palestine, sort of right now, though it's not clear that that's going to be very positive. Did Trump make a deal with Netanyahu to solve Hamas, to get the hostages back, but to strike Iran later? It's a question mark to think about. There may be some dirty geopolitics going on in the background of this hostage release, which is, of course, positive. But the key point here is, if we're going to get peace between Russia and Ukraine, they need to reach a mutually hurting stalemate. They both have to hurt enough to say, we're not going to go any further, and we will stop fighting and make a deal. Now, the problem is, of course, both Ukraine and Russia hurt very differently and asymmetrically. So if the hurt is not mutual, it opens the possibility that one side or the other may be tempted to continue the fighting again if they believe that they have an advantage, or perhaps can gain an advantage after a short truce. So that's why this has to be a sustainable peace. There are signs that both Kiev and Moscow might be reaching such a stalemate. They're facing difficulty, both facing difficult, but again, asymmetrically, facing difficulties in recruiting. They have high casualty rates. I think the Ukrainian casualty rate is much higher that's being reported from what I read. I have some figures here, but once again, nobody knows what's the most what are accurate. And so that's one area. Another area is the new sanctions being put on. Before I get to those, Russia is moving towards Bucharest. That would allow it to control the gateway to the Donetsk region. It will give it control, and this has happened in the last 24 hours. They seem to be advancing somewhat. On the other hand, Kiev has pressure on the Russian Navy in Crimea, forcing the Navy back. This is part of the game, as well as the Ukraine's thrust into the Kursk Oblast in Russia. Those areas indicate to me that there might be some second thoughts about continuing this war. Maybe. I can't guarantee it. Another factor is the new U.S. sanctions that the Biden administration imposed. Now, these are apparently aimed at the middle ground, so they won't hurt European, Turkish, or Japanese supplies of Russian gas. But nevertheless, they're aimed enough to hurt Russia. And as the United States, by the way, becomes a major gas producer and takes over the European market. And this creates a real issue, because on the one hand, Trump could be pushed by the American natural gas producers to tighten natural gas sanctions on Russia and to press Europe to buy more expensive gas, American gas. Or else Trump could use these sanctions as a bargaining chip in any peace negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. So you've got leverage here. He play that game. That's what he means by peace through strength, using leverage to pressure Russia in one way or the other. The problem is, if you pressure them too much and really put them in a corner, it'll create a Japanese reaction, where Japan, of course, attacked Pearl Harbor because of. Am I still here?
Yes, you are.
Yeah. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, because we had cut them out of their resource supplies. So I really think the Trump people, if they follow too much after Biden and continue to put pressure, peace through strength, sanctions on Russia, we could get the backlash that everybody's been fearing, but nobody wants to admit might really happen, i.e. the use of nuclear weapons. Now, so the other point here is, as Russia continues this war, it becomes more and more dependent on China for dual use military civilian technology, investment, energy markets, etc. And this creates a pressure on the Russian mind. Do we want to, we're not accepting the American hegemony. Should we accept Chinese hegemony? This, to me, is a major factor in psychology of saying, okay, we've got to cut a deal here. This war's gone too far. So I think there are factors that could could lead to a mutual hurting stalemate that can come right as Trump's coming to office within 6 months. And once Russia, as I said, achieved its goals and Podoresk and grabbing the Donbass, but Ukraine holding the Kursk region and having pressure on Crimea, plus these other factors could lead to a logic of peace as opposed to a continuation of war. Now, that though, to accomplish this, Trump himself is going to be confronted with domestic criticism. And so he has to be immune to the accusations that are already being made that he will be appeasing Putin by giving too much territory, by legitimizing Russian takeover of eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So the appeasement mantra is already starting to be the Atlantic Council people and some others are already using that against it. At the same time, he will also have to counter the view that Ukraine cannot remain neutral or non-aligned. Ukraine started its independence as being neutral and non-aligned. There's no reason why it couldn't. It's a very no reason why Ukraine can't be neutral and non-aligned. On the other hand, you're going to need to support it and find some sort of security guarantees and peacekeeping forces to help it along, but they're not going to be under NATO control. So on the one hand, he has to balance these questions, these attacks on him, that he'll be appeasing Russia, and that and those who are against declaring a neutral Ukraine. Appeasement met mutual compromise in the 19th century. It became known as capitulation in the early 20th century, of course, because of Neville Chamberlain's peace efforts at Munich. So the problem is the lesser of evils is a deal which allows some of the gains that Russia has achieved in its war effort, in this special military operation view of it, but at the same time, that gives some breathing room and allows Ukraine to exist as a state that is viable and economically viable and military self-sufficient, but not aggressive. So I think negotiations should begin to consider options of sufficient arms reductions and withdrawal rather than talk about a buildup of forces. Both sides need to talk about a building down of forces as part of the peace agreement. And that means a withdrawal of forces. It means the movement of international peacekeepers under the UN or OSCE, not under NATO, into key regions, buffers in Ukraine. And these peacekeepers have to be acceptable to both sides. They're not going to be states that one side or the other believes are hostile. It means establishing buffer zones and new other forms of compromise. Later, and here I throw this out as something that might seem like dreaming at the moment because the two sides hate each other so much, but certainly there can be territorial trade-offs, joint development projects, and joint sovereignty over specific territories, including Crimea. The idea that first of all, Crimea could be just independent and a neutral state not controlled by Ukraine or Russia. That's one option. Other options are, of course, Russia won't accept that. They want sovereignty, but that doesn't mean that it can't engage in joint development projects with the rest of the Black Sea states, including Ukraine. So the idea there that there are some areas of loosening up relations between the two in the future, not obviously in the immediate term. Now, furthermore, this is not going to, just settling the Ukraine question doesn't settle the larger issue of NATO-Russian relations. We need to begin discussions on future strategic arms deals that include U.S. and Russian nuclear weapons. These have to cover the new Continental missiles, as well as the hypersonic missiles, as well as the deployment of dual-use and non-strategic or tactical nuclear missiles. We should be eliminating, as Gorbachev and Reagan talked about, eliminating intermediate, medium range, and tactical weapons.
Let's try.
And finally, a transparency mechanism that allows each side to inspect each other's weapon systems has to be worked towards. Now, the problem is if these efforts fail to achieve peace, am I here? You can hear me. If these efforts fail to achieve peace, and Trump feels humiliated, that there's a real danger that his peace through strength, what I talked about, his democratic nature will come back, and he'll be forced to react. And that's why it's absolutely essential to react militarily to show that we're still strong, we're not appeasing Putin. And this is what could provoke a global conflict. So I'll end on that notion, which I kind of see is in between the different points of view already expressed. But certainly, when you talk peace, it's more difficult than fighting a war, and it opens the door for new wars if the peace is not settled in a sustainable fashion. I'll leave that. Thank you.
Thank you, Hall. Thank you very much. And that's a lot of nuance you've thrown out there. A lot of points to consider, and appreciate very much you sharing that. Peter just gave a little message. He unfortunately had to leave. He says that Ria Novosti has arrived to his place for an interview. He also added that Trump has posted the Tucker Carlson interview with Oliver Stone, Kuznick, and Tucker on his Truth Social.
Right.
Which is just, again, another interesting thing that I thought was worth sharing. And for those who haven't watched that particular Tucker Carlson interview, it's very easy to find. I highly recommend it. A lot of very good considerations there about the dangers we're facing and the solutions. Before we transition to a little dialogue with the audience, Ed, good friend Francesco Sedoti, who is a professor emeritus at the University of L'Aquila, has recorded a short 2-minute address to our roundtable session, which I will play, and then we'll open up for a little bit of dialogue. I know Tony Pappert had some considerations about 2 or 3 minutes that he wanted to also share to start off the Q&A, and I think Ed probably has a thought or two as well. So, Ed, shall I just play Professor Sedoti?
Okay, go ahead.
Okay.
Francesco Sedoti. My name is Francesco Sedoti. I'm an emeritus professor at the University of L'Aquila in Italy. This is my house in Rome. My curriculum is on Wikipedia. One of my fields of study is criminology, and as a criminologist, I note that unfortunately, thousands and thousands of human lives are being destroyed today and could be saved. Many crimes could be prevented. I believe that as human beings, we have a duty to fight for the ideals of dialogue, collaboration, compromise, and peace. These ideals have always existed, but today they represent a fundamental imperative in the face of the possibility of humanity's self-destruction. I'm sure you share these ideas, and I hope we can work together to do something good about it. Only a material impossibility prevents me from being with you today. So I'm using this pre-recorded message, but from the bottom of my heart, I am completely with you.
Okay. The reason I asked Francesca send this message because I wanted to show that this group is really international. We're talking about international dialogue, and we already had speakers from Washington, Paris, Rome, and I'm pretty sure in the Q&A, and Montreal, of course, Montreal. Yeah. So that's a pretty large community, but total group is about 32 countries who signed up. Not, of course, everyone is signing up every time, but maybe during the Q&A, when you say something, just indicate what country you're from. And Peter mentioned something about Yalta too, and this is I really was like lobbying for this thing with Trump, and even get some feedback because it was through Washington Times, which he probably reads. This is one of the few papers that supported him, and we talked about Yalta 2, where Xi Jinping takes place of Churchill. And now I just heard that first meeting will be between Trump and Xi. It is good. Of course, being from my background, I would prefer first meeting with Putin, but maybe on the way from Beijing, if he goes to Beijing, I don't know, or it will be in Washington. But at some point, it would be great if Putin could join, and we'll have this Yalta 2. And then invite some other, of course, countries like India, Brazil, and maybe some others. This is will be great, and maybe this will be a road to peace that we all wanted. And finally, in 2 days, January 21, there'll be another important Zoom session, which I'll be happy for you to join if you're interested. And this was a guy who wrote this book called Provoked. Because everyone's saying that Russia's invasion in 2022 was unprovoked, and Tucker Carlson, his name was mentioned several times here, is laughing when people say that it was unprovoked. But this guy, Scott Horton from Libertarian Institute, wrote a book called Provoked, which he completely, with documents, it's about 700 pages with documents, testimony, all that. And he will be speaking in Washington, the group called Statecraft Institute. I have the link. It's for those who want to join. It's on January 21 in 2 days at noon. Noon, I mean Eastern time, East Coast time. Send me a request and I will forward you the link so you can listen to Scott Horton with the book Provoked, not Unprovoked, but Provoked. Okay, thank you. And then let's go to Q&A.
All right, thank you, Ed. And yeah, please send out that link. I'll certainly be happy to listen to Scott and pose a question. And on the issue of questions, I see that there's already a number of hands, people waiting in the queue. The first to get in there was Tony, who had a few considerations. So Tony, you can do about 2 minutes of sharing of your thoughts, posing a question, and then we're going to move to the additional 4 or 5 people I saw. But please keep your questions for the most part as condensed as you possibly can, since we don't have too much time, and perhaps all 3 of the speakers today may wish to show a thought or two. So without further ado, Tony Pappert with Prometheus PAC. Go for it, Tony.
Yeah, thank you. I have a lot to say in 2 to 3 minutes, so bear with me. There's a lot of truth in what's been said, and I'm in debt to Marty for his experiences. But the big picture has not been addressed, which is that the end of history has ended, that 2 generations of policymaking, which continually went in a worse and worse direction toward the abolition of the sovereign nation state in favor of a global empire, or whatever you want to call it, has been reversed in the United States, and that the nation state is being revived. This is the big picture, which is not being addressed, frankly. I mean, the notion, briefly, I mean, Lyndon LaRouche wrote many times that the notion of the founders of our country, well, I'm an American, as I guess is obvious, the notion of the founders of our country was that the American Republic would be a seed crystal toward creating a community of sovereign nation states worldwide, a community of principle, as John Quincy Adams said, and as Lincoln said in his Gettysburg Address, and as Roosevelt projected for the post-war world. And this is most clear in his son's book, As He Saw It, that a dedication to the principles of perfect national sovereignty, the general welfare, dedication to posterity. Trump is, I mean, I've bristled at some of the contempt shown for President Trump. I mean, President Trump is an extraordinary individual and a hero, but he's not an individual who came from nowhere. He expresses very knowledgeably this American tradition. And that's what's behind the things which have been noted here. I mean, his addresses to Xi Jinping, his declaration that his first trip will be to China, his addresses to President Putin, and so forth. So that's the big picture, that the nation state is back. And far from being the cause of war, as H.G. Wells and similar British imperialists say, I mean, the nation state is the cause of peace. And the nation state is the sovereign nation state is the setting in which the greatest scientific and cultural treasures of humanity have been built. And this defines in part our task today. And the road to peace is through, as Roosevelt understood very well, and I think people here know that, the road to peace is through the abolition of world empire and the rebirth of sovereign nation state republics. These were the dream of ancient time, of Plato's book we call the Republic. But it couldn't be realized until the Renaissance. And we're now in a position to rescue a threatened humanity through the achievements once more of the sovereign nation state. That's said so briefly, it may not be comprehensible. Perhaps we'll be able to discuss it more next time.
No, I think that's a very important core concept. I mean, the idea of abolishing the sovereign nation state has been animating certain very, very ill-intended agendas for many generations. So to put that back on the table is a very important consideration. So I thank you for that. I'll open up. Does anybody want to address of the main speakers the remarks by Tony, or I'll give people Hall or Marty or Ed a chance to respond if you want, or just let it sit as we move to the next question. Everyone's on mute, by the way. You have to always unmute if you do want to speak. Right. So, in that case, we'll let that resonate a little bit. Thank you, Tony. And we'll go to the first other person behind Tony was Matthew Thomas. Matthew, you there?
Hi, Matt. Yes, I am. Just quick question for the speakers and presenters. First of all, thanks for putting this all together, Matt. This has been fabulous and just really productive conversation. In terms of discussing peace and the true underlying causes of war, I'm surprised that I haven't heard anyone in our speaking panel today mention the seemingly imminent implosion of our financial system and the $250 billion worth of derivatives and credit default swaps and other exotic financial instruments that are out there just waiting to be popped. I would love to hear comments with regard to the thoughts on what effect is the teetering of our current financial system as a contributor or as an ingredient or a driving force towards war. Thank you.
That's very good good point. Good question. And keep that in mind too, that Besant and Musk have put out messages warning of government bankruptcy. It's
Yes,
possible
exactly.
that things can be turned inside out very quickly, even before the new administration finds offices. Um, so yeah, good question. Hall, Marty, any thoughts you want to share on that? If keep in mind, you guys have to take yourselves off of mute. There's a weird mute default option here. I see Hall is trying. I'm seeing activity.
Well, I don't have much to add to it. I just could look at the way the war on terrorism added $8 trillion to our debts for with no outcome. I mean, it's a disaster, and we did that all on borrowing, and our it was all a link between Bush and our central bank, who decided that it was okay to keep borrowing on this money, even though we should have engaged in different financial measures to try to prevent that debt from accumulating. And now it's going to hit all of us. I'm living in France, where they can talk about it. The debt, every major country is just overloaded, and I really can't see. This is one of the reasons why we need to push for peace, because I can't see more and more. I mean, and this is one of the contradictions I bring out here. Just that, if you push the Europeans to put 5% more in military spending, it's going to destroy their already overheated economies that are highly in debt. I see that here in France. So we really have to move towards negotiated settlements, reduce the arms race, and address the mounting debts in that way, rather than the peace through strength option that will mount more, which will cut back on welfare measures and move towards military-industrial complex.
Yeah. On top of that, I would add, and maybe we should almost have an entire future roundtable session specifically on the systemic breakdown crisis, because it's so multifaceted and so important. But I would say one consideration that struck me as you were speaking, Matthew, were the remarks that Trump had made back in 2016 that were reemphasized in 2017, and then that stopped for whatever reason, that left the political discourse. But I'm referring here to the Glass-Steagall, the modern Glass-Steagall restoration that he had advocated for early on, which called for a very, very vital separation of investment from commercial banking as a first step to a broader bankruptcy reorganization of the system, of the too big to fails that should never have been allowed to grow to that extent.
Yep.
And if that isn't done, I don't know what can be done to deal with the obvious imminent meltdown of these. As you said, it's over probably $2 quadrillion fictitious financial instruments that have no bearing in the real world that we are being told to die to save. I don't know what will be possible to avoid the calamity unless that type of remedial measure is done, as was done by Franklin Roosevelt in 1933, break up the banks and actually put some justice on the table. Since not a single banker has gone to jail. I think one low-level guy was thrown in jail for the crimes that led up to 2008. So people do need to see some sense that justice is not just a word or some ink on parchment, but can be acted upon as a constitutional reform. So that's one thing I would say we should be trying to bring that conversation to anything and anyone who could influence policy right now, is a restoration of Glass-Steagall, which Trump promised to do years ago, that hopefully can take up a big part of his new administration. See Marty raising his hand there. Marty, what do you think?
Yes, I fully agree with Hall's assessment, and I think, again, this is a crucial issue, and it's not my area of speciality. Our own, I think, star experts on this are yourself, Matt, and Alex Kreiner, who is quite outstanding. But there are two extraordinary developments, which of course are ignored in the American media, which are happening as we speak, and they're both out of London. The first is that last week in his nomination hearings, a senator asked Trump's nominee for Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Pezant, what he thought about plans which are very far advanced to have the management, if I understand, of all U.S. treasuries transferred from Washington, D.C. to the city of London. And Besant didn't even know that this had been proposed. He said so. He was an honest man. He didn't even know that this had been proposed and was far advanced. Now, this would be an abdication of American sovereignty that has existed since the days of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington. It's an enormous issue to London now. And also, what do we see at the same time? Last week, we saw an absolutely insane proposal in London from the Starmer government, from which no idiocy that even Joe Biden is capable of, they seem determined to dwarf it. They have offered 100-year treaty of defense and security and guarantee to Ukraine, to the current non-democratic, fascist, collapsing, corrupt, crime-ridden, neo-Nazi-ridden government of Ukraine. What is the equivalent of this? It would have been if the British Empire 160 years ago had offered the Confederacy of the United States, the slave-owning Confederacy, 100-year security guarantee of protection and military alliance against the United States at the height of the Civil War. The parallel is exact, and it is important, and this is insane. So how could they be stupid enough to do it? I think both these insane initiatives come from the same issue. They come from exactly what Hall has pointed out and Dario has pointed out, the coming economic crisis and collapse, which is felt more and feared more in the City of London even than in Wall Street. And what is their solution to this? They have already poured probably $500 billion at least, if not more, into Ukraine, into their insane policies since 2022. What is the long-term aim of this? It is very clear since 2014. It is to enslave Ukraine and its vast sources of food and other natural resources, to artificially boost the Western financial system, to give a new boost to the collapsing European Union and the collapsing financial systems of the United States and Britain. This is what they imagine will bail them out. And of course, it's going to do quite the opposite. I finish this by simply saying, again, a very non-intellectual common sense. The first law of what to do when you're digging yourself into a deep hole: stop digging. And instead, they are digging the hole deeper, by far. And this, I think, is a crucial reason why the major financial interests in New York, and most of all in London and in Brussels, are bitterly opposed to a peace settlement, which would have to be on Russia's terms, to end the slaughter in Ukraine. Because they would have to give up their fantasy, their hope, that the resources of Ukraine can be enslaved for the European Union and the Western financial interests, as they tried to do in 2014, which was the motivation for the entire 2014 Maidan coup in the first place.
Well said. Well said. All right, so we have a limited amount of time, as I said. So I've got Bruce Torres, Richard Moore, Dario, and Robert, who I've seen. So we're gonna let those four questioners pose questions. Again, keep it short if you can, and we'll hopefully be able to get through this in a short amount of time. So, Bruce, good friend Bruce, it's all yours.
Hello. Thank you. It says there's 44 people on this, and these roundtables are amazing, and this one's a great one. Let's say all 44 of us share this every place we can, and let's say going forward, these just continue to grow and grow and grow, just in numbers of audience and attendees. You creators and facilitators of this, Matt, Ed, and everybody else, what one, maybe two actions could this growing number of fans of this roundtable do that could possibly be most effective? And I'll pick America since it's where I'm from.
Anyone? Ed, what do you think?
Yeah, well, actually, we're getting ready because this year it's the 80th anniversary of the victory in World War II, and two major powers, United States and Russia, formerly USSR, they were the main allies in this big war. We want to recall those days. Fortunately, this newspaper, which Marty mentioned, Washington Times, he was senior foreign correspondent, and I was working with Washington Times for over 40 years. And they have to admit, in those my op-eds, I really criticized the U.S. foreign policy, and they printed. They showed that this is really a paper which adheres to values, that freedom of the press and freedom of expressing the opinion. And right now, they still, of course, now they're not as actively publish my pieces as before, but still they let them through. And one idea is to have what we call a global forum, and to recall those days when we were allies, and maybe think about history, and maybe go back to our senses. We know that you mentioned about financial matters, but the United States is getting ready for default. At least Department of Treasury, they're considering what action to take to avoid incoming default, because $36 trillion debt. And one thing which I don't know how it is going to work, but Trump suggested simply to eliminate ceiling to total. So you can spend as much you want. You just keep printing. From the physics point of view, sometimes you have this bubble, eventually bubble is exploding. And this is what Trump is saying. So I don't know. It's crazy world. There was a movie, I think.
Mad World.
So we were back. At the time we were laughing, but now it's no longer a laughing matter. So,
has Trump said he believes that the ceiling should be completely removed? He said that?
Yes. I think many people can confirm that. Right.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I was thinking, the idea of a Yalta 2.0 idea could fold into that type of rallying program, something to fight for, as far as a very important historical moment, like Peter said, which was designed to shape the contours of the post-war world, and it represented a major battle between those who loved freedom and independent sovereign nation states, as Franklin Roosevelt represented, versus the figures of Churchill, and who he represented, wishing to restore and keep control of a global slave system instead. And within the context of the details of the imminent financial collapse, the need to make serious systemic changes in conjunction with a harmony of interests of other nations that also want to survive, that could be something that citizens could also rally around and build conferences, town halls, around trying to influence that type of discussion once again. And obviously focus on policymakers or people who are in an advisory position or some position like that, with those who can perhaps influence the ear of Trump, who does seem to be open to looking for advice from good or from bad sources. So good question, Bruce. We should always have that on our mind at all times, so we don't just get into a voyeur standpoint, but we're always thinking about what are we doing subjectively, right?
Thank you.
Marty, Hall, any thought you want to share, or should we move on?
I'm just totally for a Yalta 2.0. Perfect.
Cool. All right. Consensus on Yalta 2. All right. That's one thing right there. Okay. Richard more.
Yeah, I just like to make three quick optimistic points. The first is that I think we are going to see radical changes. And the reason I say that is that Trump is being accepted as legitimate. There's no Russiagate, even though he and Musk are breaking all kinds of taboos, saying that eastward expansion of NATO is a legitimate threat to Russia. And, there's so many examples that I don't need to give any more. Second optimistic point is that I think the people Trump is appointing can be seen as exactly what we need. if there are going to be changes, that means challenging the neoliberal consensus. And you want your change agents to have neoliberal credentials. They can speak the language. They can be seen as real people, whereas a bunch of liberals in there don't even speak the same language. The third is the fact that Trump has emphasized the economic issues with China rather than military issues. And when he talks about Greenland and Canada, that indicates a shift from imperialism to empire, in the sense that China is an empire, and where one could expect investments to go toward internal infrastructure rather than imperial quests. So I see those as all optimistic signs. Thank you.
Interesting observations. All right, it's worth considering. Any thoughts in response to that from Hall, Marty, or Ed? Okay, Hall's got a thought.
I see no way out of this other than working with China. China's the next rising power, even though it's having problems with its economy. But it's not. Its military is not going away, and its influence around the world is not going to go away. And it's really the only power that can help put the brakes on Putin in Ukraine. And the more, that's why I think it's absolutely correct for Trump to go meet with Xi Jinping even first before Putin, though I recognize Ed's point that he would like him to meet with Putin. The U.S. can't do this alone. Despite Trump's anti-multilateralism, et cetera, he's going to find that he needs to work with China primarily, India. You go down the BRICS list, Brazil, Turkey, Qatar, all these states will have to be work in a coordination to end all of these conflicts. And that's what I call contact group diplomacy, working with different the major actors and regional actors that are all interested in resolving, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, Iran, Israel, and North-South Korea. Those are the major focal points of conflict. There are others. So my point is simply that we need a larger vision. It will, whether Trump wants to call it multilateralism or not, it will be multilateral, except that it will be nation states, as pointed out earlier, that are achieving this, not the UN in itself. This approach was attempted at the end of the Cold War, the U.S. and Soviet Union in the 80s and early 90s, under Russia too, worked together and helped in a number of regional conflicts. They didn't do anything in Afghanistan where they should have, but they did work in Cambodia. They worked in Central America to a certain extent, and Namibia. The point is that a concert of countries can find compromises and work out reasonable approach to all these conflicts. Ended there.
Yep. Well said. All right. Last question is going to go to Robert. I see your hand there, Robert. Go for it.
Well, I mean, I agree with some of the points that have been said, and it's a great panel. I guess my first questions. Well, I guess with Marty, I agree with him on the Ukrainian Holodomor. It was a genocide, and it's kind of interesting why Trump wouldn't want to do something about this, because the New York Times actually engaged in Russian collusion. And I kind of wonder why Trump won't say, well, I didn't engage in Russian collusion, you did. So I think that would be helpful. And to Matt's point, I definitely agree with him on Glass-Steagall that it should be restored, and was certainly a part of the crisis and a very predictable part of the crisis. As far as Yalta 2.0, to Ed, I mean, I guess I would say, whether it's Yalta has a certain, well, older Americans, Yalta feels like a defeat, but obviously I would like to see a peace meeting, and I hope we can work together on a portion of it, like dealing with environmental cooperation, like the tree planting idea we had a few years ago might be helpful. But finally, I just think the only part, and to Mr. Hall's point, is that it's not going to be, even if they can get an agreement, I think it's not a good idea that Russia sees itself as treated like a defeated power. If they don't get if there's not a feeling that they kind of won, even if it's just taking a little bit more land, I think that it's going to be like the 1990s all over again, where they're going to be treated like a defeated power in the Europe and among the Western powers. And then that could trigger a crisis in the future. And I hope that this could be seen as that the West irresponsibly brought us to the brink of nuclear war. I do think Russia is not blameless, but I think the West, the military-industrial complex, is largely responsible for this. And I think that they have to be reined in, or there's going to be another crisis in the future. And I would say, to the point of Israel, I support Israel. I hope that they eventually defeat Hamas. I don't know if it's this deal or the next deal, but when Russian children were killed in Beslan in 2004, I don't think there's any question which side Hamas will be rooting for, which is the Islamic terrorist who committed that tragedy, as opposed to the innocent Russian children who were affected. So anyway, I hope that there could be peace. I absolutely agree with this panel on the major point that the military-industrial complex is a tragedy, and I hope Trump can do it. I don't know if he will. To Marty's point, there are a lot of very bad people in Trump's orbit, and I hope that we can all put aside our differences and work together on the main points and save the world from a calamity that's coming ahead. So good luck to us. We're going to need it.
Fair enough. Well said, for the most part. And Marty or Hall or Ed, any thoughts on that point or on any of those points?
Well, I think we have a lot of work to do, and maybe at some point we can do it more often. Now we do it like bilateral, bi-weekly. Let's see, maybe with the help of Pluralia, which is a great entity coming out from Italy, and that's why Francesca and actually Martin and I are working with them. With their help, of course, we could expand it. We definitely need more thinkers, and actually I keep saying that we need more young people to get involved. And maybe this 2025, it's special year. No, since I'm kind from mathematics of the world, it's 45 square. it's a interesting number. It also has some interesting mathematical comments about number 25. But this number has some good vibes. And let's use this year to end this war and work toward common peace, win-win. This is what we should do, win-win. Okay, it's a good beginning of the twin. We'll see what's happening tomorrow in Washington, and let's hear from Scott Horton. It's a great analyst. Which maybe will put some specific facts, details into perspective.
Thank you, Ed, for those final remarks. I think you've given us a lot to think about, and I really do appreciate these Sunday morning sessions. And yeah, let's definitely go forward with cautious optimism. There's a lot of good reason to hope. But also, we don't want to hope stupidly. We want to hope with open eyes and an awareness of evil and folly that has caused so much tragedy throughout human history. Whenever good people go to sleep, or they give themselves to a ill-founded open change without good reason, solidifying that. So, thank you everybody for sharing this with us. Thank you for the experts, and thank you for Ed for making this happen. And I hope as well. Thank you for Pluralia for being our friends.
Take care. Thank you again. Excellent discussion.